Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hollow Ranger. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you enjoy long horror stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the Hollow Ranger. Your support helps me spend more time creating longer, darker, and more immersive nightmares for you. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. I'm an Appalachian Trail Ranger. We have rules for things that aren't human. The radio call came in at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the woman on the other end was not screaming. That's the part that bothered me. She was calm too. Calm, reading off her GPS coordinates like she was placing a food delivery order, and she said, "There's a man standing about 40 feet from my tent and he doesn't have a face." I asked her to repeat that. She did. Same words, same flat tone. Then she said, "He's been there since midnight. He hasn't moved. What do I do?" I started to answer and the transmission cut. Not static, not a dying battery. The channel just went silent, like someone had pressed a finger to the signal's lips. I'm telling you this now because I don't work for the National Park Service anymore. I don't work for the Forest Service. I don't work for anyone, and that's by choice. And it's also not by choice. And if that sounds like a contradiction, you'll understand why by the time I'm done. My name is Ellis Coyne. I'm 38. I was a backcountry ranger on a section of the Appalachian Trail that runs through southwestern Virginia and into the edge of Tennessee for 11 years. People think that job is mostly telling hikers to hang their bear bags and writing citations for illegal campfires. And it is. 96% of the time, it's exactly that. But there's a manual that gets handed to you on your first week, not the official one, the one with the NPS logo and the laminated pages. There's another one. It's a 3-ring binder and it doesn't have a title, and your supervisor gives it to you in person, in the office with the door closed. He doesn't email it. He doesn't reference it in writing. He puts it on the desk and he says, "Read it here. Don't take it home. If you have questions, ask them now, because we don't discuss this in the field." I thought it was hazing. I genuinely did. My first season, 2014, I figured this was some tradition scare, the new guy with a binder full of campfire stories dressed up as protocol. I read it in about 40 minutes. There were 31 pages. Some of them had photographs, but most were typed in a format that looked like it had been updated over decades. Different fonts, different margins, some pages clearly photocopied from older documents, one section handwritten in blue ink that had faded almost to gray. The rules were specific, not vague, not open to interpretation. That's what made them unnerving. Vague rules feel like superstition. These felt like engineering. Rule 1. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., do not respond to any voice calling your name from the tree line, regardless of whether you recognize it. If the voice belongs to someone you know personally, especially do not respond. Rule 4. If you encounter a hiker walking southbound on a northbound-only section who does not appear in the trail register at any prior shelter, do not engage. Note their physical description. Radio the description to dispatch using Channel 4, not Channel 2. Do not explain why. Nsa. Rule 11. If you find a tent that has been set up with all zippers open, all belongings arranged in a single line outside the vestibule, and no sign of the occupant, mark the GPS coordinates and leave. Do not search for the occupant. Do not call out. File the coordinates under Code 7, passive. There were 31 rules. Some were mundane. Some were so specific they felt absurd. Rule 19 described a particular sound, a rhythmic clicking like someone running a thumbnail along the teeth of a plastic comb, and said that if you heard it from above you while on a ridgeline, you should descend immediately, stay below the canopy, and not look up. That one had a handwritten annotation in the margin. Eason, 2003. Confirmed. I didn't know what confirmed meant. I asked my supervisor, Dale Royce, a man who'd been on the trail for 22 years, and who carried himself with the exhausted patience of someone who had stopped being surprised a long time ago. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "It means someone looked up." I asked what happened. He said, "She transferred." He didn't say where. I want to be clear about something. I don't believe in the paranormal. I didn't then. I'm not sure I do now, even after everything. What I believe is that there are things in those mountains that we don't have a classification for. Not ghosts, not cryptids, not aliens, just unclassified. The same way there are deep ocean species we haven't cataloged. There are patterns of behavior on the trail that don't match any known animal, any known human psychology, any known meteorological or geological phenomenon. And the rules exist because, over decades of ranger experience, someone noticed the patterns and wrote down what worked. Not why, just what. You don't need to understand electricity to know not to grab a live wire. My first 3 years were uneventful. I followed the rules the way you follow a fire drill mechanically, without real belief, because the cost of compliance was low and the theoretical cost of non-compliance was something I didn't want to test. I never heard my name called at night. I never found an unzipped tent. I encountered a few southbound hikers on restricted sections, and I radioed their descriptions to dispatch like the binder said, and dispatch said copy, and nothing happened, and I forgot about it. Then came the fall of 2017, and a through hiker named Annalise Voss. She was 26 from Duluth, and she had started at Springer Mountain in Georgia in late March. I met her at the Chestnut Knob Shelter, which sits at about 4,400 feet on a bald, with no tree cover and wind that sounds like fabric tearing. She was eating cold ramen out of a Ziploc bag and writing in a journal that was so water-damaged the pages had fused together in clumps. She was friendly, sharp. She asked me questions about the trail that most hikers don't, not about water sources or resupply points, but about the shelters themselves. Specifically, she wanted to know if any of them had been decommissioned. I told her a few had over the years, old structures that had been replaced. Some had been torn down. A couple were just abandoned when sections of trail were rerouted. She asked if any of them were still standing. I said probably. The forest takes a long time to reclaim a structure with a stone foundation. She nodded and said something that I didn't think much of at the time. She said, "I keep finding ones that aren't on the map." I told her that made sense. Old shelters, unofficial structures, hunting camps. The trail corridor is only a narrow strip of protected land, and the surrounding forest is riddled with remnants. Foundations, chimney stacks, root cellars. She shook her head. These aren't old. The wood is new. The roofing felt is weatherproof. Someone is building shelters on the trail that aren't registered. I made a note of it. I figured it was a Trail Angel project, some well-meaning volunteer constructing unofficial rest points. It happens, we discourage it, but it's not high-priority enforcement. I told Annalise to note the coordinates if she found another one, and I'd report it. She said she'd found 3 so far, all on the Virginia stretch, all within a day's hike of each other, all identical. That word identical is the one that stayed with me. Not similar, not alike, identical. I asked her what she meant. She said, same dimensions, same layout. 3 walls, open front, sleeping platform for 4. Tin roof, no graffiti, no register. And all of them had the same thing nailed to the back wall. I waited. A piece of paper, she said, laminated, with a list of rules. The temperature on that bald was already in the low 40s, but what I felt wasn't the cold. It was something else. A dropping sensation, like the floor of my understanding had shifted 1 inch lower. I asked her if she remembered any of the rules. She said, one of them was about not sleeping with your head toward the opening. One was about not leaving the shelter between certain hours. And one of them, she stopped. She was looking at her journal, or what was left of it, and her expression changed. Not to fear, to confusion. like she was trying to remember something that was resisting being remembered. One of them, she said, was about what to do if someone else is already inside when you arrive. I asked what it said. She said, "Don't speak to them until they speak first, and if they don't speak for more than 10 minutes, leave." I asked if she'd followed that rule. She stared at me for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't have to. They always spoke first." I didn't know what to do with that. I wrote it up in my incident log, unregistered structures, possible unauthorized construction, and I forwarded it to Dale. He read it. He didn't respond for 3 days. When he did, it was a single-line email. "Have you confirmed the locations yourself?" I had not. Annalise had given me approximate descriptions near a creek crossing south of Lick Creek, on a ridge between 2 unnamed gaps beside a fire road that dead-ended at a clearing. They were vague. The Virginia section of the AT passes through some of the most disorienting terrain on the eastern seaboard. Ridgelines fold into each other. Valleys that look distinct on a topo map are indistinguishable on the ground. I could have spent a week looking and found nothing. But I didn't need a week. I found the first one in 2 days. It was exactly where Annalise described. South of Lick Creek, maybe a quarter-mile off trail, set back into a stand of hemlocks that were so dense the canopy blocked almost all light even at midday. 3 walls, open front, sleeping platform for 4, tin roof, no graffiti, no register. And on the back wall, a laminated sheet of paper. I stood at the threshold and read it without stepping inside. There were 9 rules. Some of them overlapped with the ones in our binder, the hours of silence, the prohibition on responding to voices. But some were different. Rule 3 on this sheet said, "If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not acknowledge them. Continue your activity. The footsteps will stop within 15 minutes. If they have not stopped after 15 minutes, leave immediately, but do not run." Rule 7 said, "The shelter may appear occupied when you return from collecting water, if the number of packs inside does not match the number of people you arrived with. Do not count them out loud." Rule 9 was the one that made me take a step back from the structure entirely. It said, "If someone in the shelter begins speaking in a language you do not recognize, close your eyes. Do not open them until the speaking stops. When it stops, one person in the shelter will be gone. Do not search for them. Do not say their name." I photographed the sheet. I photographed the structure from 4 angles. I GPS tagged the location and hiked back to my truck. And I called Dale, and I said, "I found one." He was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "How many rules on the sheet?" I said 9. He said, "The last time there were 7. I said, "Last time?" He said, "Don't go back to it at night, Ellis." And he hung up. I want to explain what it's like to work in a system that acknowledges something without explaining it. Imagine your employer hands you a laminated card that says, "If the fire alarm sounds 3 times in a row, go to the parking lot. If it sounds 4 times, go to the basement and lock the door." You don't ask why the number matters. You don't ask what's different about a 4-alarm situation. You just know that someone, at some point, learned the difference, and the card exists because of what they learn. That's what the binder was. That's what these laminated sheets were. Institutional knowledge compressed into behavioral instructions. No theory, no explanation, no ontology. Just when X happens, do Y. When Y fails, do Z. When Z fails, the binder didn't say what to do when Z failed. It just stopped. The following week, I looked for the other 2 shelters Annalise had described. I found the second one. Same construction, same layout. 9 rules, same list, word for word. But this one had something the first didn't. On the sleeping platform, someone had carved letters into the wood with a knife or a sharp rock. They weren't words. They were initials and dates. I counted 14 sets. The oldest was from 1987. The newest was from 3 weeks before I found it. I recognized one set of initials at DR, 1998. Dale Royce. I sat on a rock outside the shelter and stared at those initials for a long time. Dale had been here. 20 years ago, he had stood where I was standing, and he had carved his initials into the wood, and he had never mentioned it. I didn't find the third shelter. I looked for 2 days and couldn't locate it. I expanded my search grid. Nothing. Then, on the second evening, as I was hiking back to the trailhead, I passed a section of trail I'd walked that morning, a flat stretch along a creek. And I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. A trail marker. White blaze on a tree, the standard AT marker. But it was on the wrong side. AT blazes are always on the side and facing the direction of travel. This one was on the back of the tree, facing into the woods. I walked around the tree. The front had a blaze too. 2 blazes, facing opposite directions, on the same tree. That's not how the trail works. It's never how the trail works. A double blaze, 2 stacked rectangles, means a turn is coming. But 2 single blazes on opposite sides of the same tree means nothing. There's no protocol for it. It's not in any guidebook. I stood there, and I looked in the direction the backward blaze was pointing, and about 200 yards into the forest, through a gap in the undergrowth, I could see the corner of a tin roof. I did not go to it. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that I'm not a reckless person. I followed the rules. I trusted the system. And for a while the system worked. Annalise Voss continued northbound. I didn't see her again that season. I checked the trail registers at shelters along her projected route, and her entries were normal weather notes, mileage, complaints about rocky terrain in Pennsylvania. She seemed fine. She signed her entries with a small drawing of a bird. Then, in November, after the through hiking season had ended, and most of the shelters were empty, I got a call from a ranger named Pete Ellicott, who worked the section in Maryland. He said he'd found something strange in the register at the Ensign Colwall shelter. He said someone had filled 6 pages front and back with writing so small he needed a magnifying glass to read it. It was all rules. Dozens of them. Rules for shelters. Rules for creek crossings. Rules for what to do when you heard certain sounds, when you saw certain things, when you felt certain feelings. The handwriting matched earlier entries in the register. It was signed with a small drawing of a bird. I asked Pete to photograph the pages and send them to me. He did. I printed them out and read them at my kitchen table with a lamp pulled close, and what I read made me put the pages down and sit in silence for a very long time. Most of the rules were familiar. Variations on what I'd seen in the binder, on the laminated sheets. But Annalise had added annotations. She'd added context. After rule, she'd written small notes in parentheses. Things like, "This works. I tested it at Pickle Branch Shelter on September 3rd. The clicking stopped after I descended below the canopy. Took 90 seconds. And, only partially effective. The figure at Thomas Knob did not leave after I refused to make eye contact. It stayed for 4 hours. I think it was waiting for me to break. And, does not work if you are alone. Someone else must be present. It targets the one who acknowledges it. If you're alone, there is no alternative target. You cannot redirect its attention." She was testing them. She was systematically testing the rules. And then on the last page, she had written something that wasn't a rule. It was a paragraph. It said, "I've been on the trail for 7 months. I've encountered them 14 times. They are not the same thing every time. Some of them are mimics. Some of them are watchers. Some of them are something else. I don't have a word for the third kind. The mimics copy. The watchers observe. The third kind builds. I think the shelters are theirs. I think they've been building for a long time. The rules on the walls aren't for us. They're written by the watchers to protect us from the builders. Something is trying to help." But not all of them agree. I read that paragraph probably 30 times. Each time a different phrase stuck. Not all of them agree. That one kept me up. I tried to find Annalise. Her trail name was Wren, that was the bird she drew, and I searched through hiker forums, completion lists, social media, nothing. No completion record at Katadine, no posts after September. Her last trail register entry was the one Pete found in Maryland. After that, she simply wasn't in the record anymore. I filed a missing persons report through the proper channels. It went into the system. Nobody contacted me about it. I followed up twice. The second time, I was told the case had been referred to a coordinating office and that I didn't need to take further action. I asked which office. The person on the phone said, "I'm not able to provide that information." Not, "I don't know." Not, "Let me check." I'm not able to provide. Dale retired in the spring of 2018. I saw him once before he left, at a regional meeting in Roanoke. He looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him, which had only been 4 months prior. His hands had a tremor. He pulled me aside during a break and said, "They're going to give you the binder." I said, "I already have the binder." He said, "No, they're going to give you the real one." I waited. He said, "The one I had was 31 pages. The one they'll give you is longer. They update it when—" He stopped. He rubbed his face. "When there's new information." I asked, "How much longer?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't seen it. They don't let you see the next version until you've been promoted." He looked at me. "Ellis, don't get promoted." Then he left. He moved to Tucson. I emailed him twice and got no response. The third time, the email bounced. The address no longer existed. In June 2018, my supervisor Dale's replacement, a woman named Margaret Chen who had transferred from Olympic National Park in Washington, called me into the office. She closed the door. She put a binder on the desk. It was thicker than the one I'd been given in 2014. She said, "Read it here." I opened it. 64 pages. Same format typed, different fonts, some handwritten sections. The first 31 pages were identical to my original binder, with minor updates. A few rules had been revised. Rule 11, the one about open tents, had a new addendum. If the belongings arranged outside the tent include a journal, do not read it. If you have already read it, report what you remember to dispatch and submit to a cognitive baseline evaluation within 48 hours. The new pages, 32 through 64, were different. They weren't rules. They were incident reports. Each one followed the same template: date, location, personnel involved, description of event, actions taken, outcome, and a field labeled classification. The classifications were single letters. I saw A, B, C, and one entry marked with the letter E. There was no key explaining what the letters meant. The incidents spanned from 1979 to 2017. Some were mundane: a hiker reporting unusual sounds, a shelter found with unexplained damage. But some were not mundane at all. Incident 2004-17. A ridge runner in North Carolina reported that a section of trail near Max Patch had moved, not eroded, not rerouted, moved. The white blazes, which he had painted himself 2 weeks prior, were now on a series of trees approximately 1/4 mile east of their original position, along a path that did not exist on any map. The paint was his. He confirmed the brand, the application pattern, even a drip mark he remembered on one specific blaze. The trail itself, the worn dirt, the root steps, the water bars had been replicated. Classification: B. Incident March 2011. 2 thru-hikers reported a man sitting in the Overmountain shelter at dusk. They described him as approximately average height, wearing hiking clothes, but neither could recall any specific detail about his appearance. Not his hair color, not his eye color, not the color of his jacket, not his pack, not his face. When pressed, one of them said, "It's like trying to remember a word you've never learned." The man had not spoken. He had been sitting on the sleeping platform with his hands in his lap. Both hikers left the shelter and camped nearby. In the morning, the shelter was empty, but there were 4 packs inside. Neither hiker recognized them. The packs were inventoried. Standard gear, standard food. No identification, no permits, no personal items of any kind. Classification: C. Incident 2015-22. A ridge runner reported hearing a conversation between two people in the woods approximately 50 yards from the trail. She could hear the rhythm and cadence of speech pauses, laughter, inflection, but could not identify the language. She followed protocol and did not approach. She reported that the conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes and then stopped. When she passed the area the next day, she found a clearing she had not previously noticed. In the center was a stone fire ring that appeared to have been used recently. Around the fire ring, arranged in a circle, were 11 pairs of hiking boots, all different sizes, all facing inward. Classification: A. I read all 33 incident reports. Some were clinical, some were clearly written by people who were struggling to describe what they'd experienced. One from 1993 was only 2 sentences long. Trail section between Clyde Smith Shelter and Chestnut Knob has been marked for rerouting. Do not ask why. I looked up at Margaret when I finished. She was sitting across the desk watching me. She hadn't moved. I said, "What's classification E?" She said, "There's only been one." I said, "I saw it. Incident 2009-06. But the description was redacted. It was blacked out." She nodded. "That's correct." I said, "What happened?" She said, "A ranger broke the rules." I waited for more. She didn't offer it. I said, "Which rule?" She said, "He responded." She didn't elaborate. I didn't push it. There was something in her expression that I'd never seen on an NPS supervisor before, not discomfort. Not fear, but a kind of practiced blankness, like she had rehearsed not reacting to this exact conversation. I went back to work. I maintained the trail. I checked shelters. I picked up trash and talked to hikers and filed reports and lived a normal life in a small rental in Damascus, Virginia, and I followed the rules and nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe none of it would ever touch me directly. That lasted until October 2019. I was doing a routine patrol of the section between the partnership shelter and the intersection with the Virginia Creeper Trail. It's a popular section close to a road, easy terrain, lots of day hikers. Not remote, not isolated, not the kind of place where anything from the binder should apply. I was walking northbound at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I came around a bend and saw a woman standing on the trail about 60 yards ahead. She was facing away from me, standing perfectly still. She was wearing a bright orange backpack, the kind of color you'd notice from half a mile away. I called out, "Hey there, everything okay?" She didn't move. I walked closer. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Nothing. Not a twitch. I was maybe 30 yards away now, and I could see that her posture was wrong. Not injured wrong. Geometric wrong. Her arms were at her sides, but they were perfectly parallel to her body. Not relaxed, not tense, just aligned. Like someone had positioned her. I stopped walking. I stood there, and I felt the first real pulse of something I had never felt on the trail before. Not fear. Recognition. Like a word you've read 100 times, suddenly being spoken aloud. I knew this, not from experience, from the binder. Rule 26, new section. If you encounter a solitary hiker who is standing motionless on the trail and does not respond to verbal contact, do not approach within 20 feet. Observe for 60 seconds. If the hiker does not move, turn around and take an alternate route. Report the location. Do not describe the hiker's clothing in your report. Describe only the location and time. That rule had always struck me as odd. Why wouldn't you describe the clothing? That's basic incident reporting. You always describe what someone is wearing. It's the first thing SAR asks for. But the rule was specific, and I followed it. I stood there, and I counted to 60, and she did not move. And I turned around, and I walked back the way I'd come, and I took a side trail to the Virginia Creeper and looped back to my truck, and I filed the report exactly as instructed. Location, time, no description of the hiker. I thought about it all night. I couldn't sleep. The orange backpack kept flashing in my mind. Bright, specific, memorable orange. And the rule said, don't describe it. Why? What possible reason could there be for omitting the most identifiable detail? I called Margaret at 7 a.m. I told her what happened. I asked about Rule 26. I asked why the clothing description was prohibited. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because the clothing changes based on who's looking. I didn't understand. She said, if two rangers encounter the same figure on the same day, they'll describe different clothing, different pack, different colors. But the location will be the same. The posture will be the same. The behavior will be the same. She paused. We learned a long time ago that describing the clothing creates confusion. It makes us think there are multiple subjects when there's only one. It makes us think the situation is different from what it actually is. I said, what is it actually? She said, we don't know. That's why we have the rules, Ellis. I accepted that. I shouldn't have, but I did. 2 weeks later, I was checking the register at the Thomas Knob Shelter, a high-elevation structure near the summit of Mount Rogers, the highest point in Virginia. October up there is already winter. The shelter was empty. The register was in its usual spot, a waterproof box on the sleeping platform. I opened it and flipped through recent entries. Normal stuff. Hikers complaining about the ponies, weather reports, trail conditions. Then I found an entry dated 3 days prior. The handwriting was neat, small, precise. It said, Day 219, Shelter 7. Rules confirmed. 1, 3, 4, 7, 8 are reliable. Rule 2 is conditional works only in structures with 4 or more walls. Open front shelters require modification. Rule 6 does not work. Do not rely on Rule 6. They have adapted. It was signed with a small drawing of a bird, Annalise, Wren. She was still on the trail. She'd been missing officially for over a year. No social media, no family contact that I could find, no completion record. But she was still out here and she was still testing the rules, and she was telling anyone who read the registers that Rule 6 didn't work anymore. I went back to my binder. Rule 6 on the laminated shelter sheets, the ones I'd photographed at the unregistered structure, said, if you hear breathing from beneath the sleeping platform, stomp 3 times. The sound will stop. She was saying they had adapted, that the counter behavior no longer worked, that whatever responded to the stomping had learned. I need you to sit with that for a second, because that's the detail that changed everything for me. Not the faceless figures, not the moving trail, not the impossible shelters. The fact that the rules had an expiration date, the fact that the things on the trail were learning. I drove to every shelter on my section over the following week, every register. I found 3 more entries from Wren. Each one updated the rules. Each one was dated. Each one added new information. At the Chatfield shelter, she wrote, new behavior observed. Mimics are now appearing during daylight hours. Previously restricted to 2 to 4:30 window. First daytime encounter, September 14th near Rhododendron Gap. Full daylight, clear weather. Appeared as a southbound hiker. Spoke. Used correct trail terminology. Asked about water sources ahead. Gave accurate information about shelter distances. Conversation lasted approximately 4 minutes. I did not realize it was a mimic until after it left and I checked. There is no water source where it described one. The information was plausible but fabricated. They are getting better at passing. At the Wise shelter, she wrote, "The third kind, the builders have constructed a new shelter near the intersection of the AT and the old railroad grade south of T's. Do not enter. The rules posted inside are different from previous shelters. The rules posted inside are wrong. They are instructions, but they are designed to produce the opposite of safety. Someone, I believe one of the watchers, has been altering the sheets in the older shelters, replacing correct rules with incorrect ones. I have begun marking the correct shelters with a symbol on the northwest corner of the roof. 3 parallel scratches. If you find a shelter without this mark, do not trust the rules inside." At the old orchard shelter, she wrote the longest entry. It filled 4 pages. Most of it was rule updates, things she'd observed, counter behavior she'd tested, windows of time that were safe and windows that were not. But at the end, she wrote something that wasn't about rules. She wrote, "I think I understand the structure now. The mimics are camouflage. They don't want anything from us. They're testing how convincingly they can interact. Each year they get better. The Watchers are something separate. They maintain boundaries and they write the real rules because they have been watching for longer than we have. They understand the behavior patterns the way we understand weather patterns, not perfectly but well enough to create forecasts. The builders are the problem. The builders are constructing something. Not shelters or not just shelters. The shelters are components. I found a map. She didn't describe the map. She didn't say where she found it. She just wrote, I found a map. If you're reading this and you're a ranger, ask your supervisor about the Kinsey survey. It's not what it sounds like. Ask about it by name. Watch their reaction. I read that, and I put the register down, and I drove straight to the ranger station. Margaret was in her office. I sat down and said, "What's the Kinsey survey?" She didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't do any of the things people normally do when they're processing a question. She just sat there, and the color left her face in a way that I can only describe as structural, not like she was going pale from shock, but like the blood was being summoned somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that needed it more urgently. Then she said, "Where did you hear that name?" I told her. I told her about the register entries, about Wren, about all of it. She stood up. She closed the blinds. She locked the door. She sat back down and said, "The Kinsey survey was conducted in 1971. It wasn't a survey. It was a mapping project. A team of 3 rangers, 2 geologists, a cartographer, and a wildlife biologist were sent to document a series of anomalous trail sections that had been reported since the 1950s. Sections where the trail didn't match the maps, where distances between landmarks were inconsistent, where hikers reported temporal disorientation, arriving at shelters they'd already passed, finding blazes on trees that hadn't been there hours earlier." She paused. She was choosing her words with the precision of someone diffusing a device. The team spent 11 days in the field. They carried survey equipment, theodolites, measuring chains, the standard tools. They mapped a 12-mile section in southwestern Virginia. What they found was that the trail, in certain areas, was not fixed. The physical geography was stable, the mountains, the rocks, the water features, but the trail itself, the path through it, was shifting, not eroding, not being rerouted by weather or use, shifting. Blazes appearing on trees that had no blaze marks under UV light. The paint hadn't soaked into the bark. It was sitting on the surface, as if it had been applied minutes before. Shelters appearing in locations where no construction permit had been filed, and no materials had been transported. She looked at me. 5 of the 7 team members completed the survey. 2 didn't come back. I asked what happened to them. She said, "That's classification E." I said, "Both of them?" She said, "No, one of them is classification E. The other one is still on the trail." I stared at her. Since 1971. We find register entries sometimes. Different handwriting than the others, very precise. Technical, uses terminology from the 70s, measurements in chains instead of meters. She paused. He's still surveying. I left her office and then I sat in my truck in the parking lot for about an hour, and I tried to fit everything I knew into a framework that made sense. It didn't fit. The pieces were all wrong shapes. I had a missing hiker who was voluntarily living on the trail, testing rules against entities she'd categorized into 3 types. I had a mapping team from 1971 that had partially disappeared, with one member apparently still active 50 years later. I had shelters being built by something that wasn't human. I had rules that worked until they didn't because the things they were designed to manage were evolving. And I had a binder that grew longer every few years because the situation was not getting better. What I didn't have was a theory. I didn't have a why. And that's the part that keeps you up at night, not the what, but the absence of why. I started making my own notes. I'd carry a pocket notebook on every patrol and write down anything that didn't match baseline. A blaze that looked too fresh. A shelter that felt wrong, and I mean felt, in a way I couldn't quantify. A sound that didn't belong to any bird or mammal in the region. The time I found a trail register with pages torn out, and the torn edges were clean, like they'd been cut with a razor, not ripped. Over the next 2 years, I accumulated about 300 observations. Some were nothing. Pareidolia, confirmation bias, the human brain pattern matching against noise. But some of them clustered, and when I plotted them on a topo map, they formed a shape I didn't expect. They formed a line, not the trail, not a road, not a ridgeline or a drainage or any natural feature. A straight line, running roughly north-northwest, cutting across the topography at an angle that ignored the landscape entirely. Mountains, valleys, rivers. The line passed through all of them without deviation. I measured it. 23 miles, almost exactly. It started near the old railroad grade south of Tees, where Wren had said the builders had constructed a new shelter, and it ended at a point on the map that was, as far as I could tell, nothing. A spot on a wooded slope with no trail, no shelter, no feature of any kind. I should not have gone there. Every instinct, every rule, every piece of institutional knowledge told me not to. But I need you to understand what 300 data points does to a person. It makes you feel like you're close. Like understanding is within reach. Like one more piece of information will make the pattern resolve into meaning. It doesn't. The pattern doesn't resolve. That's the trap. I hiked to the endpoint on a clear day in April 2021. It took me 6 hours of off-trail bushwhacking through rhododendron thickets so dense I had to crawl in places. My GPS tracked my progress. I was headed to coordinates 36.728 degrees north, 81.564 degrees west. A nothing spot. A blank space on the map. When I got there, I found a clearing. Not a natural clearing. The trees had been cut. Stumps were visible, sawn clean, at a uniform height of about 6 inches. The clearing was circular, maybe 40 feet in diameter. In the center was a structure. It wasn't a shelter. It was a platform. Concrete. Level. About 10 feet by 10 feet. It had no walls, no roof, no apparent purpose. It looked like the foundation of something that had been removed. Or the foundation of something that hadn't been built yet. On the surface of the platform, someone had painted or etched or burned. I couldn't tell a series of markings. They weren't letters. They weren't symbols I recognized. They were geometric, precise. They looked like a diagram, but for a system I had no reference for. And at the edge of the platform, sitting on the concrete, was a pair of hiking boots. They were old. The soles were worn smooth. The laces were missing. They were caked in dried mud that had turned to dust. I picked one up and looked inside. On the tongue, someone had written in permanent marker, Kinsey, 4, the number 4, the 4th member of the Kinsey survey, from 1971. I put the boot down. I stood there in that clearing, and I looked at the platform, and I looked at the trees. and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The stumps, the ones ringing the clearing, each one had something carved into the flat top. I walked to the nearest one and brushed away the debris. Initials and a date. TM 2003. The next one, PL 2010. The next, SH 1994. I went around the circle. 14 stumps, 14 sets of initials. I recognized one. A V. 2019. Annalise Voss. I photographed everything. Every stump. Every marking on the platform. The boots. The clearing. I hiked back out, and it took me 7 hours because I got turned around twice in the rhododendrons, even with GPS, even in daylight. And both times I got turned around, I ended up facing the clearing again, as if the forest was funneling me back. The third time, I ignored the GPS entirely and just walked downhill. Water flows downhill. Streams lead to creeks. Creeks lead to roads. I followed gravity and reached the trailhead at dusk. When I got to my truck, there was a note under the windshield wiper, a folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a rule. One rule, typed on plain white paper. Rule 32. If you have visited the clearing, you will be contacted. Do not respond to the first contact. Do not respond to the second contact. On the third contact, you must respond, or a fourth contact will not be necessary. I drove home. I locked my doors. I sat in my living room with every light on and my phone in my hand, and I waited. The first contact came at 2:17 a.m. A knock at my front door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. I did not respond. The second contact came at 2:17 a.m. the following night. Same knock, same rhythm. I did not respond. The third night, at 2:17 a.m., the knock came. 3 knocks. I stood at the door. I could see through the peephole that no one was on my porch. The porch light was on. The steps were empty. The yard was empty. The street was empty. I opened the door. On the welcome mat was a binder. Not the NPS binder. Not the 31-page version. Not the 64-page version. This one was at least 2 inches thick. On the cover, in handwritten block letters, someone had written, "Complete." I brought it inside. I opened it. The first page said, "You have been selected for inclusion in the monitoring program. Your observations over the past 3 years have been noted and are appreciated." The following pages contain the full operational guidelines for the Appalachian Corridor. Please read carefully. Compliance is expected. This document supersedes all previous versions. It wasn't signed. It wasn't stamped. It wasn't attributed to any agency, any office, any person. I turned to the second page. It began Section 1, Classification of Non-Human Trail Entities. There are currently 5 recognized types. Wren had identified 3. The binder listed 5. 2 more. 2 kinds that Wren hadn't encountered or hadn't survived encountering. I read for 3 hours. I read about the mimics, which the document called Type 1 adaptive. I read about the watchers called Type 2 observational. I read about the builders called Type 3 structural. And I read about Type 4, which the document called integrative, and Type 5, which the document simply called resident. Type 4 was described in clinical language. Type 4 entities demonstrate the capacity to integrate with human populations for extended periods. They occupy social roles, maintain employment, and sustain interpersonal relationships. They are indistinguishable from humans in all observable metrics. Identification is possible only through behavioral analysis over extended periods. Specifically, Type 4 entities do not deviate from routine. They do not improvise. They do not respond to novel situations with genuine adaptation. They respond with plausible approximations of adaptation. The distinction is subtle and requires trained observation. I read that paragraph, and I thought about Margaret Chen. I thought about how she had answered every one of my questions with prepared precision, how she had never once been surprised, how her reactions were always exactly appropriate. Never too much, never too little. How she had transferred from Olympic National Park, a location I had never verified. How she had replaced Dale, who had warned me not to get promoted. I kept reading. Type 5. Resident. The description was short. Type 5 entities are permanent occupants of the Appalachian Corridor. They do not move. They do not interact. They are fixed to specific locations and have been present at those locations for longer than any existing record. They are not dangerous. They are not safe. They are infrastructure. Infrastructure. That word used to describe a living thing or a thing that occupied the category where living things should be. Infrastructure like a bridge, like a road, like the trail itself. The rest of the binder was rules. Hundreds of them. Rules for every situation I could imagine, and dozens I couldn't. Rules for what to do if the trail beneath your feet changes texture while you're walking. Rules for what to do if you meet yourself coming from the other direction. Rules for what to do if the stars at night are in the wrong positions. Rules for what to do if you realize you've been hiking for longer than the daylight should allow. And at the very end, a final section. It wasn't rules. It was a list. Names and dates. Hundreds of them, going back to 1923. Next to each name was one of two notations, active or absorbed. I scanned the list. Annalise Voss active. The Kinsey team members 3 marked active, 1 absorbed, 1 active, 2 absorbed. Dale Royce active. Dale, active. Dale who had retired to Tucson. Dale whose email no longer existed. Dale who was apparently still what? On the trail? Part of the trail? At the bottom of the list, in the same handwritten block letters as the cover, someone had added the most recent entry. Ellis coin pending. I closed the binder. I sat in my living room. The lights were on. The door was locked. The house was quiet. And I understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical weight, that I had never been an observer. I had never been outside the system, looking in. The rules weren't designed to protect rangers from the trail. The rules were designed to manage us, to sort us, to determine which of us noticed, which of us investigated, which of us went to the clearing. The rules were a test. The binder was an invitation. And I had accepted. I didn't go back to work after that. I called in sick for a week, then 2 weeks. Then I submitted my resignation by mail. No one from the NPS contacted me about it. No exit interview. No paperwork follow-up. My final paycheck appeared in my bank account with a memo line that read, "Thank you for your service to the corridor." Not the trail. The corridor. I moved to Roanoke. I got a job at a hardware store. I tried to stop thinking about it, and for about 6 months I did. I didn't hike. I didn't go near the mountains. I didn't open the binder, which I'd put in a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Then, last spring, I was stocking shelves in the lumber aisle when a woman came in and asked me where the roofing felt was. I pointed her to aisle 12. She thanked me and walked away, and I watched her go. And I noticed her boots. They were trail boots, worn, dusty, the kind of worn that comes from hundreds of miles and not a weekend, and on the back of her jacket, so small I almost didn't see it, someone had drawn a bird. I followed her to aisle 12. She was examining sheets of tin roofing. She turned and looked at me, and I said, "Wren." She didn't react. She studied me the way you'd study a map, looking for landmarks, for orientation, for confirmation that you're where you think you are. Then she said, "You found the clearing." I said, "Yes." She said, "You got the binder." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you read the list?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you know you're pending." I said, "What does pending mean?" She set down the tin roofing. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her face that I recognized. Not fear, not determination, exhaustion, the kind that comes from knowing something you can't unknow. She said, It means you still get to choose. I said, choose what? She said, active or absorbed. I said, what's the difference? She said, active means you keep going. You maintain awareness, you stay yourself, but you're part of it. You patrol, you watch, you write new rules when the old ones stop working. You become one of the watchers. I felt the next question in my throat before I could stop it. And absorbed? She picked up the tin roofing again. She walked toward the register. Over her shoulder, she said, absorbed means you become infrastructure. She paid in cash. She walked out. I watched her get into a truck that had no plates and drive south. I'm telling you this from my apartment in Roanoke. It's 3 a.m. I haven't slept in 2 days. The binder is on my kitchen table. I've been reading it again, and I found something I missed the first time, a page that's thinner than the others, almost translucent, tucked between sections like it was meant to be hidden. It has one sentence on it. The trail is not a path through the mountains. The mountains are a structure around the trail. I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of it means. But I know that tomorrow morning, or the morning after, or some morning soon, I'm going to wake up and feel it, the pull, not a voice, not a knock, just a gravity, like the slope of a hill you didn't realize you were standing on. And I'll put on my boots and I'll drive south and I'll park at a trailhead and I'll start walking. Because that's what pending means. It means you haven't decided yet. But the trail has already decided for you. I checked my bank account yesterday. My last paycheck from the hardware store had a memo line. It said, "Thank you for your service to the corridor." I've never given them my account information. I've never told anyone where I work. The rules say don't respond to the first contact, don't respond to the second. On the third, you must respond. I think this is my third contact. I think I'm responding right now.